Jerusalem, 1099, a city surrounded by stone, well-defended, well-supplied, and confident, and yet it fell to an army that, by all rights, should never have survived the journey. This channel tells stories about moments that only look inevitable in hindsight. Wars decided not by heroes, but by systems, by discipline, patience, and choices made under extreme pressure. Stories where history turns quietly, and then never turns back. This isn't just the story of how Jerusalem was taken. It's the story of why it was even possible. Why an improvised coalition of foreign nobles, starving pilgrims, and rival commanders managed to do what regional powers had failed to prevent for centuries. Because the First Crusade wasn't won by faith alone. It was won by timing, fragmentation, and decisions made long before the walls were ever breached. To understand Jerusalem in 1099, you have to step back not just years, but generations. For centuries, the Eastern Mediterranean had been ruled not by chaos, but by a delicate balance. The Byzantine Empire was still a major power. Islamic caliphates governed vast territories. Trade moved, cities thrived, and pilgrims traveled. But beneath this surface stability, the systems holding it all together were weakening. In the Islamic world, unity had fractured. The Caliph in Baghdad was a symbolic figure, but real power had splintered into competing dynasties. Seljuk Turks controlled much of modern-day Turkey and Syria, but they weren't a single entity. Local emirs ruled cities like personal kingdoms. Loyalties shifted constantly and rivalries hardened. Jerusalem itself changed hands repeatedly in the decades before the Crusade. Fatimid forces from Egypt had just taken the city from the Seljuks in 1098, barely a year before the Crusaders arrived. The garrison was competent, but it was newly installed. Its defenses hadn't yet been fully adapted for a long, grinding siege. Meanwhile, in Europe, pressure was building. Population growth was straining the land. Younger sons of nobles inherited nothing, and private warfare was constant. The Church was struggling to contain all this violence within Christian lands. When Pope Urban II spoke at the Council of Clermont in 1095, he didn't create aggression, he just redirected it. The call to liberate Jerusalem was framed as a spiritual duty, but its success depended on something else entirely. Europe had a surplus of fighters, and the Eastern Mediterranean had a surplus of divided defenders. This wasn't destiny, it was alignment. The First Crusade nearly failed before it ever reached Jerusalem. The journey itself was a catastrophe. Tens of thousands left Europe with no unified command. Armies marched separately. Supply lines were improvised or just didn't exist. Many died before they even saw a single battlefield. Yet something unusual happened along the way. Against all expectations, the Crusaders adapted. At Nicaea they coordinated with the Byzantine Empire easily, but effectively. At Dorylaeum they learned how to survive attacks from mounted archers by holding their formation. At Antioch they endured a brutal siege, starvation, and betrayal, and they still held on. Antioch was the turning point. Not because it was conquered, but because the Crusaders didn't collapse afterward. They paused, they reorganized, they argued, but they stayed together. By the time the army turned south toward Jerusalem in early 1099, it was smaller, but it was harder, and it was more disciplined than the force that had left Europe. Most importantly, the Crusaders no longer expected rescue. They understood something critical. If Jerusalem was to be taken, it would be taken with what they had left, not with what they wished they still had. When the Crusaders reached Jerusalem in June 1099, they faced a harsh reality. The city sat high above the surrounding countryside. Water was scarce. The summer heat was relentless. The defenders understood this. They had poisoned or destroyed the wells outside the city. They had removed all the livestock and secured all the supplies inside the walls. The Crusaders had no fleet, no immediate reinforcements, and almost no siege equipment. This was the moment where impulse could have destroyed everything. An immediate hasty assault failed. Ladders were pushed back. Men fell from the walls. Morale started to waver. But the commanders did not repeat their mistake. Instead, they waited. They gathered timber from miles away. They dismantled ships at the port of Jaffa and hauled the beams overland. They built siege towers, not quickly, but carefully. This delay was dangerous. Every single day risked disease, desertion, and the arrival of a relief army. But discipline prevailed over desperation. The Crusaders divided responsibilities. Each section of the wall had assigned leaders. Resources were rationed. Plans were synchronized. On July 13th, the final assault began. It wasn't a single chaotic charge. It was a controlled multi-point attack designed to apply pressure. When one siege tower was repelled, another advanced. When one section of the attack stalled, another drew the defenders' attention. On July 15th, a breach was forced near the northern wall. Once inside, the outcome was decided not by chaos, but by momentum. Jerusalem fell because its defense collapsed systemically, not heroically. Command broke down, coordination failed, and the city couldn't recover once the pressure became too great. The capture of Jerusalem was swift once the walls were breached, and it was brutal. Violence followed. Not as a strategy, but as a release after years of fear, hunger, and loss. But strategically, the Crusaders did something unexpected again. They stopped. They secured key positions. organized a new government, and prepared for a counterattack. Within weeks they faced a Fatimid army from Egypt at Ash, and they defeated it, not because they were stronger, but because they struck first, with cohesion and clarity of purpose. The First Crusade ended not with celebration, but with consolidation. A kingdom was declared, defenses were reinforced, supply routes were secured. Jerusalem was no longer a destination, it became an obligation. The taking of Jerusalem reshaped the world for centuries. It didn't create endless war overnight, but it locked the regions into a cycle of retaliation and memory. The Crusader state survived not through dominance, but through a fragile balance dependent on alliances, sea power, and constant vigilance. For the Islamic world, the loss was shocking, not because Jerusalem was always their central focus, but because it exposed a deep vulnerability. Over time, leaders would respond, systems would adapt, unity would return, slowly and deliberately. Figures like Zengi Nur ad-Din and Saladin would emerge, not just as reactions to faith, but as architects of political and military reform. The First Crusade succeeded because it arrived at a moment when coordination on the other side failed. Later crusades would not be so fortunate. Jerusalem was taken once by surprise. It would not be lost that way again. The crusade wasn't inevitable. It worked because multiple systems failed at the same time, and one improvised force learned faster than anyone expected. History often remembers the result, but rarely the conditions that allowed it to happen. If you want to explore another moment where discipline, patience, and structure quietly changed the world, tell us in the comments which story should come next. And if this is the kind of history you want more of, consider subscribing. Thanks for watching.